Okay, thank you for the introduction, Michael. So I'm going to give reflections on the current semester of teaching at the Jinan University of Birmingham Joint Institute, which will be shortened to J-BJI for the rest of this presentation. So first of all, just to say, I've been teaching on this program for 3 years. I've previously taught at the University of Birmingham, and for the last year or so, I've been deputy lead in the School of Maths in relation to Jinan, which has meant that I've had some involvement in planning for this current semester, as well as involvement in delivering teaching this semester. I'd like to give a bit of background, but first I'd just like to say the reflections that I'm going to discuss here are not really just my own. They are formulated from work that my colleagues, in particular academic colleagues, 8 of them who have taught this semester, have contributed, and administrative staff who've also contributed hugely to the delivery of teaching this semester. So to clarify some details, to set this all in context, our students at the J-BJI study applied mathematics with one of either economics and statistics, information computing science, or mathematics. I think that one translates into the Chinese system better than it does in English. And there's a 2-to-1 split. So that means in the first 3 years of the degrees, if you consider 120 credits in each year, students study 80 credits of applied mathematics. That's taught by the University of Birmingham staff. Student numbers, there's about 215 in year 1, 200 in year 2, and 75 in year 3, with the caveat that a few of those year 3 students are currently based in Edgbaston studying in the University of Birmingham. So actually there's about 100 students in year 3, but 75 based at the J-BJI in principle. So the J-BJI is based in Guangzhou, South China, and typically when University of Birmingham staff teach there, we'll go out for 4 weeks, and we'll teach in person. So each staff member is typically responsible for 20 credits worth of teaching, and this will be delivered in 2 disjoint 4-week blocks. Usually it'll be 4 weeks on, 4 weeks off, then 4 weeks on again. So lots of flights. And semester 2, the current semester of the 2019-2020 academic year, was originally scheduled to begin on the 17th of Feb and due to end 28th of June. Now, in January, it became clear that travel restrictions were being imposed in China, and by about early Feb, it was clear, and a decision was made, that teaching would take place remotely. So this didn't give us lots of time to prepare for remote delivery of content. And so some of the decisions that I will discuss now, that should be borne in mind. And I'll try and highlight where I think we could have improved or could have done things in an alternate way, where I can. And if there are any questions about things I've missed, please just ask them and I'll get to them afterwards. I should actually clarify that sometimes these 4-week blocks were reduced to 3, which was one of the main considerations for limiting what we do in certain capacities. Okay, so this is what a typical teaching week would look like at the J-BJI if the University of Birmingham staff were actually flying out. Yes. So for a 10-credit course, it would typically be taught in 4 weeks, and that would mean in each week we'd give 6. Well, a student would see that we would give 6 lectures. So there'd be 2 on 3 distinct days, say, and they'd get 2 support classes, 1 on Wednesday, 1 on Friday. Now, this does change a little bit between years, but for the purpose of this talk, this is an approximation of what we do. For the lecturers, actually, this will be doubled. So actually, we'd typically double teach this and a bit more if we were there in person to the different cohorts of students. Now, with lectures and support classes, we would also ask the students to submit formative assignments in groups. And these will be marked by lecturing staff at the end of the week. So the reason these are here is to give students opportunity to get feedback on, I guess, deeper aspects of mathematics. So proofs and, I guess, longer questions which are not so straightforward to answer. Essentially things that you couldn't assess using a computer that easily. In addition to this, every 2 weeks, the students will complete a summative Möbius assessment. So Möbius is our computer-aided assessment system we choose to use, another one to add to the list. And I'll go into more details about that. If you want to know more about it, go to digitaled.com, the link at the bottom. In addition to the summative assignments, we also hold weekly office hours. And these could be between 2 or 5 a week. I think the minimum is 2, and it can be, I think last year I gave about 5, 1 each day. So, yeah. And I should say here, actually, sessions last for 45 minutes. So in a 4-week block, you get 24 lectures, which is comparable to the amount of lectures you receive in a 10-credit course at the University of Birmingham in 1 semester. So the idea is that we deliver about a comparable amount of material to what they deliver in the University of Birmingham in the School of Maths. Okay, so there are some things here that we knew were going to be difficult to deliver. And so the following slide is what we actually are delivering this semester. So the current teaching week at the J-BJI, that is going on right now. Some of my colleagues are probably teaching at this moment. The current teaching week looks a bit more like this. So that is the lectures. We decide we can't risk doing these live because connections between UK and China can be a bit patchy at times. And we need to sort of ensure that lecture course content is made available to students. So that would be through documents or HTML format things if they have them, or video content. And so in terms of replacing the lectures, what we've gone for is pre-recorded videos to mirror what we're delivering the lectures. Now, that pre-recorded videos deliver one thing. You can deliver content with them, but the interaction in a lecture is lost completely. So we needed to find a way to sort of replace that interaction between students and staff. And so the way we went for this was to have post-video question and answer sessions. So typically, for example, on a Monday or particular days of the week, we'd schedule 2 sessions in a timetable to say, these are allocated for watching videos for a particular course. And at the end of the day, the lecturer will be available to answer questions about that. So it might have been at the end of the day, or it might have been immediately afterwards. But yeah, and so the point is the scope for that interaction between the module lead and the students taking the course was still there. It wasn't exactly the same as in the lecture environment, but it seemed to work reasonably well. I'll go into that later. But, so we added these QA sessions after the video sessions on each day. In addition to this, we scheduled an extra support class for students each week. And this was due to sort of, I guess, appreciation on both sides, that is from the UK side and the Chinese side, that is academic sides, that we don't know how this is going to affect students. And it may be the case that we need to deliver a bit more support. We don't know exactly how much, but we feel like we need to do something extra. So we've scheduled an extra support class session for Wednesday. And so instead of having 2, we typically now have 3 support classes per week. And in terms of the way these are delivered, so the support classes are delivered live. So we use Zoom to deliver these sessions. I think we went through a sort of procurement stage of which software we could use, and Zoom came out best, in particular for links to China. For things within the UK, actually, things like Big Blue Button were okay, actually. But yeah, there are more options, I think, that work well if you're just dealing with UK framework, but just deal with interaction with students based in the UK. But there are more issues when trying to connect between UK and China. Okay, so another decision we made, which, well, we made it mostly on the basis that we knew it was highly likely we were going to have to compress some of the teaching blocks from 4 weeks to 3 weeks. And in the past, when this has happened, the students have a higher workload each week and they clearly get a bit stressed. So we wanted to do something to minimize the workload a little bit. We didn't think would have a huge knock-on effect. And so one thing we did was remove the weekly group submitted formative assignments. I think in retrospect, this clearly had, well, not clearly, but it had, I believe, an effect on peer support within the program. So these formative assignments would essentially give every week, essentially it would force students to work together to some extent to submit some work. And this has been removed. Now, if you take into account that also all our students live in the same dormitory typically, well, dormitories typically, so male and female separated. But yeah, so if you bear in mind, actually, the peer support on campus is quite large in scale in the sense that people are always bumping into their peers and talking to their peers. Now that this has been removed, I think actually this did have a reasonable knock-on effect in terms of the way students have engaged with the, well, not engaged, but perceived the program this year. And I think that's something that needs to be considered carefully next year. Okay, the fortnightly Möbius-based summative assessments, I will say something more about now. So initially when these were set up, they were set up to be closed book, in-class, computer-based tests. We ran those for a year, and then after running them based on practical and pedagogical considerations, we switched from this, I guess, assessment off learning style assessment to an assessment for learning style assessment. So that is, we switched to open book assessments, which were open for longer periods of time and gave us the opportunity to ask questions that were a bit more advanced than in a time-limited closed book test. And that's meant this year went a bit smoother in terms of summative assessments, the caveat being year 3. So we hadn't planned to implement that for year 3 this year. That would have been next year. But at least in this session, we didn't change things too much. And this works reasonably smoothly, and I'd recommend considering this for people who are considering implementing computer-aided assessment for the first time. The office hours stayed reasonably the same. We just delivered them remotely via Zoom, so that stayed there. But yeah, and so yeah, we didn't really change that. I think the interaction in office hours this year has been less so in person. So there were far fewer people interacting in office hours for me personally this year when compared to last year when it was all in person. And that's partly there are obvious factors why that may be the case. Okay, in terms of reflections, now in terms of video content, what we would do typically is, well, actually at the start, we'd give a schedule for when certain videos or certain lecture course content needed to be viewed. So we'd do this before the course started. So for the entire teaching block, students knew what they were expected to have done at certain points in the course. And we'd actually schedule, the QA sessions were really designed to focus on those particular bits of knowledge in the course. So we wouldn't end up having these post video watching QA sessions covering everything in the course. And yeah, I'd say actually these worked reasonably well. And so actually, you know what, something you can do here, which I think I hadn't done in the past, was actually you don't need to get, so in our case, we scheduled 2 sessions for say a Monday. That meant 90 minutes worth of videos. There was no particular reason why both of these needed to be 45 minutes. They needed to add up to roughly 90 minutes, but they didn't both need to be 45. So this meant that if I wanted to produce a video for introducing them to the Argand diagram, which technically they've already seen, I could do this in 5 minutes or so because they've already seen it. Whereas if I was introducing the definition of a determinant, which they've never seen, and I need to introduce permutations and give some examples, maybe that video lasts a bit longer and I can make that maybe 35, 40 minutes. And yeah, so you can tailor the length of videos to the actual topics you're delivering. You don't need to feel so fixed to this 45-minute lecture slot length. And I think that's actually one thing that I found quite helpful. And I do plan to use some of the videos I've recorded this year for elementary topics in future, but that's a different thing.
John, could I just let you know you've got about 4 or 5 minutes?
Yep, that's fine. I've only got this slide and the next slide. So with this, so another point to say is you can implement a blended learning style with these videos. So if students are watching videos in advance, then obviously there is some aspect of blended learning here, but the extent you can do this, it changes. So I think some people, myself and Jingyi, who taught the year 2 module, I taught the year 1 module in this semester, or a year 1 module, I should say. We went for a more similar style to lectures and let the students ask us questions that arose naturally. Whereas Dan, who taught one of the 3rd year courses, tried a sort of more blended learning approach where he'd leave gaps in the notes and tell the students to go away and look and fill in the gaps themselves. And these gaps would then prompt the discussion that happened in the QA sessions and the other live sessions or seminars or example classes that happened later in the alternate times in the week. So you can use the videos, you can set things up in a slightly different way than you would normally if you were giving a sort of relatively standard lecture course. And it's something I think one should consider. Additionally, with these videos, you can monitor student engagement. I think one has to be a little bit careful with this because not every student learns in the same way. Some students will be happy to just take the lecture notes, read them, and that's how they engage. Some students will watch all the videos, possibly multiple times, and that's how they engage. And yeah, so I think in terms of student engagement, this should be monitored in various ways, not just one. So you could pick video watching, you could pick attendance in the live sessions, You could pick completion of summative assessments to a certain degree, a certain satisfactory degree, I guess. And that's the way I've chosen to sort of look at it, the last of those, in terms of the overall point I'd like to say. Yeah, so I think one of the few things I would say is giving some material in advance is helpful for the students, in particular, so they can self-pace their learning if they want, but also it helps mitigate against IT issues, because sometimes systems go down. And if content is available in advance, students can hopefully still access it, even potentially you can't. So yeah, I'd say that making bits of material available in advance, not necessarily solely relying on live sessions, is something I'd strongly advise for delivery in, yeah, the next thing. And yeah, now in terms of live sessions, so in terms of the QA sessions that follow the videos, video watching sessions, I was, given that these were meant to mirror the opportunity for students to ask questions, I thought these were really well attended. And actually, we got questions pretty much all the time. And some of these sessions would go on considerably longer than the 45 minutes time allocation. Lots of them lasted for about 60 odd minutes. And I'd say at the start of semester, okay, you can take numbers of participants in Zoom, but depending on the way the students have accessed the class, these numbers can be a little bit unrepresentative. But from a rough impression, I can say at the start of semester, I was getting probably between around a quarter of the class showing up for these non-mandatory sessions. And by the end of the semester, there was probably about a fifth to a sixth of the class still turning up to these non-mandatory sessions and asking questions. The mandatory attendance sessions, that is the example classes or the support sessions, these were really well attended throughout the semester. I mean, again, the numbers from Zoom are slightly dodgy, so I can't, in terms of the data that's come out of it, isn't as clear as I'd like it. But from actually giving the sessions live, I think the lowest number of students in one of those classes was probably, it was at least two, it was lowest level was about 2/3, I think, in those live sessions. So at the end of the semester, I was relatively impressed by that. Some practical considerations for people delivering these for the first time, as in this session, we actually had admin support staff in these sessions to help us as lecturing staff, but also to help the students who had access issues to the sessions. So if students had access issues to these sessions in the initial stages, they could contact a member of admin support who was in the session and available to help them out. So I think this did quite a lot to improve the student experience in these sessions. And if, for example, a lecturer has left the mic off or not switched share their screen correctly, there would be at least someone in the room who could just immediately inform them. Yeah, so I think that was a good piece of practice from a practical point of view that I'd recommend to people. How the lecturer receives questions should be considered. Here we're in a webinar where we've got this QA feature, but one should be careful to say, choose if you want to receive questions in the chat function or via letting people release their mic and ask questions that way, because it can make your life considerably more difficult or easy depending on what you want, or the student's life difficult or easy. You can, of course, take questions in advance. And I think this came up as a general thing. Actually, in the mandatory attendance sessions, material from those actually could be received in the session. It could be from questions live. It could be from questions via email. And it could be from questions actually people have asked in the QA sessions, the non-mandatory attendance earlier in the week, if it was deemed suitably appropriate. And in terms of people getting overloaded by emails, actually, a lot of the time, what I'll tell students is, or I told students and my colleagues as well, was saying, if a student asks a good question via email and several other people have asked the same, often I'd say, well, I'm going to go over that in the mandatory live session tomorrow because 5 other people have asked that same question. So
John, you've got about a minute or so, and then we need to, afraid, move on to the Q&A, if that's okay.
Fine. I'm pretty much at the end. So before thanking people, I would just like to say the overall message, really, which is, so we've delivered this, and largely it has not gone, I'd say it's not been that stressful, but it has been bumpy, to say the least. But the overall message is, I can't give out data at this point, really. It's not my place to, I need to share that with colleagues first, really, before doing this. But there's not been a drastic change in performance in summative assignments from this year to last. And so I taught my course last year, gave assessments in the same style last year. The only difference is now it's remote compared to in person. And yeah, in terms of absolute value of mean and things like this, it's not changed that much. So actually the performance is somewhat reassuringly similar. That's not the whole story. And I do plan to, with some of my colleagues, Daniel Jones and Jingyi Huang, to write some of this up so it can be hopefully useful to other staff in other institutes. And I suppose I would like to thank all of my colleagues associated with teaching at the J-BJI this semester. In particular, Dan and Jingyu, who have contributed a substantial amount to this reflection today, and Rachel Ducroix, our TNE officer, who supports with all tertiary national education, international things at the University of Birmingham, and Olivia Lee, who has been administrative support in Guangzhou, based in Guangzhou, and that's administrative support in all of our live sessions, amongst administrative support in all kinds of other aspects, and her team of Amy and Olivia too. So at that point, I'll stop and say thank you for your attendance, and I'll take any questions.
Brilliant. Thanks, John. I think a round of applause there for your fantastic contribution. And I think some really quite personal insights as to the challenges of having to adapt your teaching to online delivery very, very quickly. What I'll do, if it's okay, is probably only take one kind of question. But then, John, if you wouldn't mind sort of typing out some responses to questions that kind of come through, and we'll sort of try and answer things that particular way. I think as the workshop progresses, if you could tag who your question is aimed at, so this is for delegates in the Q&A, we can make sure that they're directed appropriately. But I think I'll go with the question that's kind of come in first, because there's a number of other colleagues who've touched upon this as well. Which comes in from Sarah Santos, which is, John, how many students in the post-video Q&A session? So how many students did you have in the sort of post-video sessions? Did they have questions? Did they interact? Were these sessions compulsory? And have you got any more thoughts on challenges or experiences of running these particular types of sessions?
Sure. So I can talk about my one specifically, and I from speaking to Dan and Jingyu at least, I think the engagement was at least similar, if not slightly better. So I would typically get about 40 to 50 students in these post video watching QA sessions, which when compared with people asking questions live in class and people who come up and ask questions immediately after class, there was quite a few more. The 50 is quite a few more than what would usually happen in the live setting. And in those sessions, they were entirely student-led because they were non-mandatory. So the post-video watching sessions were not mandatory to attend. And these were optional in the same way it is optional for students to ask questions in lectures or ask questions at the end of lectures. So we wanted to keep something optional. And yeah, these sessions were completely led by students. Students would ask questions and I would respond. In the support sessions, these would be typically part led by me and part led by questions in session. So yeah, these would be a mixture of the two. And so the support sessions, not the post video watching QA sessions, would be mandatory attendance, and we would expect mandatory attendance. Now, at the start of the year, it was pretty much 100%. I'd say by the end of the year, it was realistically getting closer to not 100%, more like probably between 2/3 and 3/4, maybe a bit higher than 3/4. But after looking through the Zoom data I have on it yesterday, I know that it's not as reliable. It needs to be whittled down a bit before we can actually start saying things exactly. Yeah. So in terms of, I can't remember if there were any other aspects to that question. Oh, okay, here we go. So to say we took a register, Zoom automatically takes a register, but it's not perfect, especially if people change their names in the middle of the session. So you can get people logging in twice, and that counts them twice. If they change their name, that counts as an extra count. So in these sessions, the register wasn't perfect. It was reflective of something, but it wasn't perfect. So it requires actually someone sifting through it before you can really use it. I think when you're in terms of monitoring engagement through attendance, there are solid things you can pick, like whether or not someone's clicked a link in a Blackboard page, which you can generate statistics from. And there is Zoom data to say, well, this user's got in, they've called themselves this, and they've been here for this many minutes. And one thing is quite solid, and the other thing requires a bit of work to be solid. And so if you're monitoring attendance, there are different measures you can take. So completion of the computer-aided assessment was a pretty solid measure. So you need to log in, and it logs exactly who the user is. So that was a relatively solid way we could use to monitor attendance in the course. And that was, I'm going to say, above 95%, probably above 96% people completely those typically.
Brilliant. So thanks, John. I'm going to let you have a well-earned swig of tea before you kind of start tapping out all of the responses to the Q&A. We will look to make these responses kind of available through the website. But I think if we just thank John again for a great personal insight into that experience of moving from traditional to online teaching.